and it's the first 18 verses, and it says this. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life. He came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came and sat down under a solitary broom tree, and he asked that he might die. "It is enough now. O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." And then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. And suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." And he looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, "Get up and eat. Otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank, and then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. At that place he came to a cave, and he spent the night there. And then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away." And then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also, you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Father, we ask that the words that we have just sung might be the prayer of our hearts, that you would speak and that you would renew our minds, that you would speak and help us grasp the heights of your plans for us, that you would speak and that our faith would grow, that you would speak until your church, until we are built and become more like Jesus, and that the earth will be filled with your glory. So come, Holy Spirit, opening our ears and our eyes and our minds and our hearts today. Come speak your word to us and transform us. For the glory of Jesus, we ask. Amen. Well, Here we are with Elijah. I don't know how you find Elijah as a biblical character. I don't know whether you find him easy. I don't know whether you find the stories about him easy. I have to say I don't at all. I really don't. I find Elijah very, very difficult, really, to relate to. Or to warm to, really. I mean, we do have lots of stories about Elijah, don't we? We probably heard some of them when we were in Sunday school. Elijah fed by ravens, you know that one? Miracle provision of food. And whenever we were taught to say how great it is, and I'm not saying it's not great, but even at a young age, with a dad who was a very keen bird watcher, I knew a thing about ravens. I knew the sort of food they ate. I wouldn't have wanted it. It may have been miracle provision, but it was a little bit more like a divine bush tucker trial, if you ask me, because they pick up roadkill, stuff with maggots in it and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I wasn't really all that impressed with that story, if I'm really honest. I thought, well, that's quite nice, but, you know, I could have done without it. And then, of course, you turn the page and you get to 1 Kings 18, and that's just a bit like a blokey action movie, isn't it? A bit like a kind of a prequel to Die Hard or something. You've got a big showdown with the prophets of Baal. There's people slashing themselves and raving and screaming to their gods. There's animals being slaughtered. There's fire that comes down from heaven. That isn't normal fire, because it's fire that's so fierce and hot that it consumes, yes, all the slaughtered animals and all the wood, but it consumes the stones as well. And if that just isn't enough action for you, following this completely blokey bit of movie action, you then have the slaughter of all of the prophets of Baal as well. Now, pardon me if I don't really find that very, I don't know, I can't relate to it. It's beyond my experience, and I find it a little bit awkward. Then you turn the page and you get to the bit that we've just listened to this morning. And the Elijah I see here seems different to me. And maybe the Elijah I see here seems a bit more familiar to me, because I sense I can identify with this Elijah. And maybe I can identify him in this state, with him in this state as well. I suppose the ex-A&E nurse in me is already filling out some kind of psych referral form for him, to be honest. Because the Elijah that we meet in this chapter 19 of 1 Kings is exhibiting all the signs of clinical depression. He is exhausted. He is spent. There is nothing left of him. He is anxious. He is fearful. He is unable really to rest. He just wants it all to stop. And you know, the only way that he now thinks it can all stop, and to be sure that it stops, is that he dies. That's the state we find him in here. You see, this is really the story of some public national victory and personal private depression. This is a story of the interplay between the depths of human despair and the continual call of God on a person's life. But it's still not an easy picture, I mean, let's be honest. But maybe it's just possibly more familiar. Maybe it's more within the experience of some of us, who maybe have been on a journey that has threatened to take us to a similar place. Or maybe we have journeyed or come alongside somebody else who finds themselves just like Elijah, sat under a broom tree, just hoping that they might die. You see, we often, I think, skip to the end of this bit. We do that so often because we know the stories. We skip to the end with the bit with the wind and the earthquake and the fire and then the silence, and then we tell ourselves we've just got to be a little bit more quiet because God's in all of that. But what we fail, I think, to do when we do that is we fail to identify the journey that Elijah is on that brings him to this moment of ministry at the mouth of the cave. And this really is what I want for us to focus on this morning. The journey to that moment of ministry at the mouth of the cave. And like any journey, it's made up of lots of different steps. And Elijah's journey, it seems, starts with him running for his life. It starts with it, in effect, stepping away. He's running away. You know, we all have, I think, flight or fight responses, don't we? We all do. It's an innate thing. It would seem as though Elijah's done the fighting all right on Carmel, but facing Jezebel, I mean, I think it was a bit of an understatement when, Jezebel said, basically, I'm going to chop you to pieces. And the next bit was, at this he was afraid. I bet he was afraid. It's a bit of an understatement. Oh, was he? Really? That's funny. Facing Jezebel is a completely different matter for him. At the beginning of 2020, before the world went completely crazy, I went on sabbatical, didn't I? 3 months. 3 months sabbatical that was 3 years overdue. So I felt really ready to be away from the daily routine of church life and ministry. And I had quite a plan for what I was going to do on my sabbatical. But unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I should say, for all of us, God had a plan that really didn't seem to fit my plan at all, in any way, shape or form. Because I was ill, nothing really serious, really nothing serious. But I was absolutely wiped out for about the first half of my sabbatical. And it dawned on me that although I'd told myself I was on sabbatical, I was going to be able to spend a lot more deliberate time with Jesus, I was going to be able to do all of this stuff, and I'd got loads of stuff planned to do, and it was all properly holy stuff, there was nothing wrong with it. The truth actually was, I was on the run. I was on the run. Because running away looks like retreating and withdrawing. Do you know that? You can make it look like retreating or withdrawing, but as Elijah and countless others have found, running away doesn't really solve any of your issues or address any of the problems. Running from the threat of Jezebel puts this massive difference between Elijah and Jezebel, but it doesn't solve any of the problems at all. And let me just remind you, the distance that he'd run, it was no tiny distance. It's about 300 miles. It would be the equivalent of us running from here up to Berwick-upon-Tweed or somewhere like that. I mean, that's quite a long way, isn't it? And it seems a sensible thing to do, to put that kind of distance, really, given the threat. But was it? Was it? Let's be honest, when we feel scared or when we want to avoid confrontation or when we just want a quick and easy fix, then the easiest thing to do is to run away. But what we then find is we don't solve any problems because those problems catch up with us. And then we have the same problems, but just in a new situation with new faces around us. If you never address your problems, if you never address the issues that maybe follow you, running away isn't good. It solves nothing. And yet let's acknowledge that the feeling to withdraw or step away isn't wrong. It isn't wrong. We read frequently, don't we, of Jesus withdrawing, but he didn't run. Because Jesus embodies a better way to address those fears. And in many ways, the journey that Elijah is on is one that leads him into this better way. Jesus withdraws in Gethsemane. And it's really obvious, isn't it, that he's scared and he's frightened. And he knew all that was set before him, but he still didn't run. But he does step forward to meet those who then come to arrest him. John 18 says that. Jesus, knowing everything that was going to happen, went out and said to them, "Who is it that you want?" Elijah steps away from his crisis, but he does so to run away. And this sounds familiar to me, because I'll want to step away, but to hide, not to face things because I feel inadequate. Because I feel ill-prepared, but because I feel underqualified, because I feel unable to do something. I wonder, what about you? What about you? What makes you run away? If you talk to people who were involved in looking after and journeying with those who were involved in CAP, Christians Against Poverty, they talk about how often they come across things like a drawer full of bills or a shelf rammed full of unopened bills. Basically a place where everything you need to run from can be put so you don't have to face it. And I think that we all have that to one degree or another in our lives. So this journey to the mouth of the cave for Elijah starts with stepping away, a running away. And maybe because of the realisation that actually running doesn't really solve any of the issues, the next thing we really see in Elijah's journey is a stepping to the edge, I think. A stepping to the edge in raw honesty because he comes face to face with his own limits. Because he basically comes and says, "Oh God, I've had enough. I've had enough. I can't take it anymore. I can't deal with it anymore." And there is an honesty here about facing the reality of your own limits. Because it seems Elijah can face up to the prophets of Baal, but Jezebel is another thing. It's beyond his limit. He can't. My guess is we've all had to face the reality of our own limits at some point or another, and especially we've had to face the reality of our own limits in the last year and a bit. We all have limits. We have physical limits, push it a little bit too hard at the gym, go a little bit further on your run like I'd done the other week when I ran down into town. And I was enjoying a fabulous run first thing in the morning, no one here, and then I realised I was going to have to run back up the hill to get to the manse and thought I was going to die running up through the graveyard. I've never felt closer to God for a little while, let me tell you. In my head thinking, I ain't doing this again. Because I'd reached a physical limit. We have physical limits as well, maybe through health concerns, reminding us our bodies have physical limits. We have emotional limits where there's too much pain, we're emotionally drained. We have emotional limits of disappointment or stress or anxiety or frustration. All of these things push us to the edges of our emotional limits and things become more than we can bear. And I think we have spiritual limits too. When we realise we reach them, when through busyness we end up just trying to do everything on our own strength, and we realise we've ignored God. Because we haven't really got time to keep asking him what he wants. Or maybe, a bit like the prophet Jonah, we're confronted with God really not doing what we want. Really not doing what we expect. And all of a sudden we see our spirit and our will are so distant from God. We are beyond our spiritual limits. And sometimes our faith pushes us beyond what we feel we can bear. And we find ourselves saying, God, what are you doing? And that can be a really dark and isolating place to be, I think. Maybe the wise and the strong among us are those not who have higher limits, but those who know what their limits are and are ready to admit them honestly before God. I wonder, do you feel you can be honest in this way before God? Do you know what your limits are? Are you standing on the edge of them at the moment? Not a nice place to stand. Not a comfortable place to be. In thinking about this awareness and honesty around limits, I've again been reminded of a story of Jesus in Matthew 14. Jesus was told by John the Baptist's disciples that John the Baptist had been beheaded. And what does Jesus want to do? Well, he wants to do what any human being would want to do. He wants to withdraw and to a deserted place. Of course he does. Because in moments when we feel we're being stretched beyond our limits, our reactions are to withdraw. But of course, in this story, Jesus is followed by a shed load of people. And unlike how I imagine my response to be in this situation, because I think I'd have probably told them to do one, Jesus has compassion on them. He continues to minister to them, heal them, cure them of their sickness and disease. And after hours of this, the disciples start getting concerned, not really about Jesus' welfare, but about how they're going to feed them all. And we hear Jesus say, you give them something to eat. But I wonder whether the way he says this is a little bit different now I've considered his need to withdraw. I wonder really whether it was something along the lines of, my cousin has been killed, I need to be somewhere quiet, and I've been doing this ministry stuff all day. For the love of all that is holy, you feed them. I mean, maybe he didn't say it exactly like that, but he'd have been well within his rights to, wouldn't he? Of course, as soon as they're fed, the disciples are on a boat. Jesus gets to withdraw to be alone and to be away from crowds and people and ministry and all the expectations that surround it. You see, Jesus is aware of reaching an emotional limit with the news of his cousin's murder, and he wants to withdraw. I wonder whether being honest before God about where we feel we are maybe helps us to withdraw rather than run away. So as we come here this morning, are you withdrawing or are you running? With everything that's going on for you at the moment, are you aware that you might be reaching your limit somewhere? And are you really able to be honest with Jesus about this? The journey to the mouth of the cave is marked by steps away, but it is marked by stepping to the edge in honesty and facing the reality of personal limits. And now we see this glorious little moment of rest. Did you notice the moment of rest on the journey? I like this bit. I really like this bit. I mean, he's exhausted. He's knackered beyond belief, I reckon, running all of that way, facing up to the honesty of his limits. And basically, he hands God his resignation letter, doesn't he? I ain't doing it anymore. Just kill me. I mean, that's how bad it was. And he falls asleep. I'm not surprised he does, actually. And it's only now that we begin to see how God responds to Elijah's request and situation. And the response from God doesn't really come with a full contingent of blue light emergency teams, lots of action, questions, fuss, but just with this angel who gently rouses him from sleep to eat and drink. And there's no horrible bush tucker trial now, is there? Because it's not a mucky puddle. The water's in a container, I notice, and it's a cake. I mean, I know they're talking about a cake of bread, but I just heard it as cake. A cake baked on a hot stone and some clean water. How glorious is that? Next time you think all you can do is make a cake, know that it can be seen and understood as divine provision, because this is the passage that says it is, all right? Sometimes rest and cake and drink are enough and the very best thing for us. Next time you duff yourself up about meeting just to sit and eat cake and have a rest, realise in Scripture sometimes, I'm not saying become a glutton, but sometimes that's what we need. And we need to allow ourselves that. Because here we see God allowing Elijah to do it. He doesn't say, oh, for heaven's sake, pull your socks up, man. He lets him sleep. And he provides them with water and cake. Surround yourselves with cake-making friends, my friends. See, Julie Green, she's more of a blessing than you think she could be, isn't she, eh? May this gentle moment of response also speak to us, to each one of us, as a reminder that sometimes, sleep, cake and drink is what we need, but also let it inform us of what journeying with somebody else on this path might require from us. No massive plan of action, no fuss, no endless questions, but just time to rest, to eat, to drink, and to know someone is there. Someone is alongside. And this rest enables strength to take the next steps on the journey. It doesn't make it all right, but the direction of those next steps, I think, is offered by the question that we hear God asking Elijah. Because there are no questions, I notice, that are asked of Elijah until he's reached the cave. And maybe it's here that we get this little inkling as to what might be about to happen. Because in Exodus 33, that we thought about a few weeks ago, we read about Moses, who was more than a little hacked off with the people of Israel following the golden calf episode, and very perplexed at God's decision not to accompany the people as they move forward on their journey. And he then says, he asks God, I want to see your glory. Show me your glory. And God says to him, I'll put you in the cleft of a rock and I'll cover you with my hand until I've passed by. And so here we find Elijah. And he's safe within the womb-like security of this cave. And God says to him, what are you doing, Elijah? What are you doing here, Elijah? And I think this is always God's call to each one of us. It's a call that asks us to reassess our position. It's a call that is an encouragement to speak openly with the one who knows us and loves us. Because God doesn't ask that question because he doesn't know why you're here. Because he does. What are you doing here? And Elijah's response, I think, is really interesting. Because it's a bit like a pre-prepared speech, isn't it? And if I may say so, I think it sounds a bit like a whinge. I think he becomes a whingy old bloke here, if I'm honest. He blames everything on everyone else. Did you notice that? It's not really his fault, it's everyone else's fault. But Elijah is no wimpy whinger of a man, really. He's the great prophet of God who's confronted and defeated the prophets of Baal in the power of God in a dramatically powerful way. But here he seems to just play the blame game. Maybe there's some value, though, in identifying that others might affect the way you feel, but blaming them for all of it? I think this falls into the trap that Elijah is in here. Being able to say, when you do this, I feel this, isn't blaming, that just states a fact. But a long speech about the Israelites had rejected you and Jezebel's threatened me and made me feel terrified, it puts all the blame on everyone else for his own feelings, which means, do you know what that means? It means he doesn't have to own them in any way. And this means he has absolutely no responsibility in having to deal with them either, because they're not his fault. They're not his. They're somebody else's. Somebody else's fault. They're not his. You see, God's question to Elijah directs him in a way to step inside and identify and own his feelings. To identify them and own them as his. Owning our feelings and not blaming others for them is a really important thing to grasp, I think, partly because we can start to honestly own the feelings that we have. We can start to see how God can be involved in them and how God can use them to work and to work in us and shape us and mould us and free us from the hold they can have over us too. Because blaming others and not accepting the way in which we feel in many ways, I would want to suggest to you, can deny something of what it means for us to be human. Created in the image of God, created to be those who are journeying to be more like Jesus, because Jesus had feelings. Jesus felt pain and grief and fear and disappointment and frustration and anger, and he could have blamed everybody else for all of those feelings, but if he had have done, would he have truly owned them in a way that means that however you and I feel, we know that we can go to someone who truly understands? Jesus could have blamed others for his pain, the pain of his suffering and the things he felt, but he chose to suffer. He chose to feel and accept his feelings. He chose to forgive and not to blame other people. You know, when we're scared and hurt and anxious and jealous and angry, let's remember it's us who are scared and hurt and anxious and jealous and angry. And these are things that there are things that might well contribute to those feelings for us, but the feelings are mine and I must own them, because I can't respond to them properly if I don't. Feelings can be a little bit like an alarm, I think. They're alarms that actually bring attention to things that are unseen or unacknowledged that need to be addressed and acted upon. Unless we're ready to stop to own our feelings, we can't ask God, why do I feel this way? Why do I feel this way? What are you showing me about myself? What do I need to allow you to do in me or through me to address why I feel this way in this moment? So as we've thought about the steps on this journey to the moment of ministry at the mouth of the cave, we've seen stepping away, running away. We've seen a stepping up to the edge and honestly facing personal limits. We've seen the pause for rest and cake and sleep. And we've seen this stepping in to acknowledge our own feelings, and it's only at this point that the invitation comes to step forward to the mouth of the cave and to meet with God. So as we come to this moment, I just want us to take a breath and allow some of the questions that were thrown out by this story so far to find a place in our hearts and minds today. You know, are there things that you are running away from at the moment? Can you be really honest about the places where you sense you're reaching your limits, whether they be physical or emotional or spiritual? And how are you feeling this morning? And as you think about that one, resist the urge to go, okay, thanks. And what are you doing here? What are you doing here? I think it's really important that we notice, last step, guys, it's really important that we notice that the one thing that draws Elijah to the mouth of the cave was the one thing that is not usually associated with what is called a theophany, a moment when God shows up. Because it's the sound of sheer silence. All of the usual powerful signs of wind and earthquake and fire that usually just accompany a moment of divine appearance, they come and go, and we're told God wasn't in them. He wasn't in any of them. It's the sound of sheer silence that caused Elijah to step forward. I suppose he doesn't really need the wind or the earthquake or the fire, because let's be honest, he's probably seen all of that on Mount Carmel. You know, he's been there, done that, got the T-shirt, really, hasn't he? He's aware of God in all of this, but in the nothingness of where he is right now, that's where he needs to know and experience God. And of course, this then, I think, makes some sense. Because wind and earthquake and fire, do you know what? They have a beginning and they have an ending, don't they? The wind blows and then it goes somewhere else. Earthquakes start and they usually stop. Fire burns and then it either burns itself out or is extinguished. But silence, it could be argued, has no beginning or no end. The sound of sheer silence fills everything. The sound of sheer silence envelops everything. We can't often hear it because we fill the space with so much noise. And it can seem like a vast nothingness, silence, in which you can so easily be lost. And it's in this space of apparent nothingness that Elijah needs to know God is. In this space of apparent nothingness that Elijah needs to know that God is for him. In this space of absolute, seemingly nothingness, that Elijah needs to know God's with him. I wonder if there's anyone here this morning who, just like Elijah, feels caught in a space of apparent nothingness. And you really need to know, right where you are now, that God is, and that God is for you, and that God is with you. It's in the silence that the voice of God speaks, the God who knows what we need. God meets us where we are, and the same question is asked, what are you doing here, Elijah? And as I notice the answer is given exactly the same way, I wonder what real difference this encounter has made to Elijah. I mean, how's this moment of God's response to Elijah's resignation and burnout made any difference? Has it? Because Elijah just spouts forth the same thing, didn't he? But this step that seems to mark the end of this journey, you see, actually marks the first step of the rest of it. A stepping forward to meet with God in the nothingness of silence brings about a recommissioning. Elijah is given new tasks and new assignments. God will not accept his resignation. God will not permit Elijah to give up office. Why? Because God has called him. Because God knows him. Because God knows his potential and gifts and abilities. He knows what he can bear, and he still has a plan and a purpose for him. You know, when we have the courage to make this journey to this moment of ministry at the mouth of the cave, each one of us too, I think, has this opportunity to encounter the truth. And that truth is that when we feel at our weakest, unable to face stepping forward to acknowledge the truth of our limits, unable to face stepping in to take ownership of our feelings and the truth of what we're doing in the places we find to hide, the truth is that God, our Heavenly Father, has a hold of us. That God will not accept the excuses we create to resign. God will not permit us to give up the calling and the identity that is ours in Jesus Christ. Why? Because he loves you. Because he's chosen you. Because he knows you. And he knows your potential and your gifts and your abilities. And he knows everything that you can bear, and he still has a plan and a purpose for you. You know, running like a gold thread through this episode of Elijah's story, I think we can see there is an inextinguishable desire in the heart of God for us to meet with him. For us to know his presence with us in all of the ways we might expect to, but also in the nothingness moments when we struggle to imagine God is or could be close and present. So all it really leaves us to say is this, or me to say is this: are you ready today to step forward to the mouth of the cave? Because I believe that our Heavenly Father waits today to meet with you, to bless you, to fill you, and then to send you out into his world, recommissioned, to flesh out his love in all of the places he's going to call you to this week. Are you ready to step forward to the mouth of the cave this morning?